va a hacer ahí.
Sí. Gracias. Tiene que ir hasta entonces para que aquí no hay.
¿En serio?
Hay unos papeles, pero
No vestidos de quinceañera. No están, no, mañana. Sí.
So obviously the situations at Dom Phillips. Okay. What's the name of your husband? What's your husband?
Porque es el último que va
Oh,
a
yeah,
encabezar
okay.
bueno, sí, pero
Yeah, I only talked to Dom Phillips one time some years ago, like by like Skype talk. Yeah, very sad story. Yeah. Yeah, from the UK. Yeah. Right. So, but like, so when you live in the Amazon, you live in like Altamira. Okay. Okay. And like, where's how big is Altamira? Okay.
¿Conoces al Ramos?
No, no es la primera vez que estoy aquí.
Testing, can you hear me? AJ, you can hear me in the back, right? Okay. Okay. Hello, thank you for coming. Okay, I think that we can start now. I did tell our distinguished panelists that people getting out of classes may be trickling in. Please text your friends who are outside and ask them to come to this really special and unique gathering of the winners of the Cabot Award. After 2 years of not getting together in person, this is such a wonderful occasion to bring back these extraordinary, brave, brilliant journalists to our school for this prize, which for us is very much on par with the Pulitzer Prize as one of the most important awards we can bestow upon journalists who risk their lives every day to tell stories that matter very much to the world, to the United States, and beyond. My name is Elena Cabral. I am the Assistant Dean for Academic Programs here, and I'm also a juror of the Cabot Prizes. I'm a former journalist at the Miami Herald, and as you know, someone who is very connected to these countries through personal and professional means, this is a true honor for me to be here hosting this discussion. We were able to invite back the winners from the last 2 years to celebrate, and so we have, you know, an abundance of riches here. In fact, we have another panel tomorrow on a related but slightly different discussion. Today, we're going to be talking about how journalists cover the news under dangerous conditions. And as you will hear from the journalists, these conditions can vary from government harassment to outright violence, and in regions that are as varied as Brazil, Mexico, and elsewhere. I'm going to briefly introduce the Cabot, the winners, and then ask a series of questions. I also invite you to ask your questions and to come to the microphone when you do, so that it will be recorded on this session. Javier Garza Ramos is an independent journalist in Mexico. For more than 25 years, Javier has been a journalist committed to serving and informing his community under the most extreme circumstances, while also dedicating himself to journalist safety in Mexico and elsewhere in the world. Having experienced firsthand violent attacks in Mexico as editor-director of El Siglo de Torreón, Javier established safety protocols that reporters and editors started to follow when covering violence or being at risk. These protocols were soon replicated in other newsrooms in Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica, Colombia, Ecuador, Chile, and United States. After he left El Siglo, he continued to be an advocate for freedom of the press and the protection of reporters in Mexico and beyond. Javier started new journalistic projects and brought focus to the importance of local news. Welcome, Javier. Eliane Brum, is an independent journalist in Brazil. With threats against the Amazon rainforest and its indigenous people on the rise, Eliane decided to move to a town in the heart of the Amazon at personal risk. This is just one example of Brum's dedication to coverage of the Amazon and other social and environmental issues in Brazil. Her stories and opinion columns have been published globally. Since 2013, she has written an op-ed column for Spain's El País. She also contributed to other major media outlets, including The Guardian, The New York Times, and Süddeutsche Zeitung. Over the course of her 30-year career, Eliane has often covered issues related to human rights and social justice. She's the author of 7 books and director and co-director of 4 documentaries. Her latest book, translated into English, The Collector of Leftover Souls, Field Notes on Brazil's Everyday Insurrections, which made the National Book Awards longlist for translated literature in 2019. Adela Navarro is from Zeta, a newspaper in Mexico. Adela is a powerhouse of journalism in the Americas. As a reporter and editor of the weekly magazine, she exemplifies the best qualities of investigative reporting by holding authorities accountable and exposing their corruption and complicity with drug cartels rampant in the U.S.-Mexico border region. Nominated by the staff of Zeta for her courage and leadership, Navarro is known for her critical and independent stances. She and her staff have been the targets of attacks, intimidation, and even extreme violence. In 1988, Zeta co-founder Héctor Félix Miranda was assassinated, and another co-founder, Jesus Biancornelas, survived an assassination attempt in 1997. In 2004, another staff member of Zeta was killed under Navarro's predecessor, Francisco Javier Ortiz Franco. In recent years, the magazine has been again the target of constant attacks and smear campaigns by various Baja California state governments. Despite these pressures, Navarro refuses to be silenced. Under her leadership, Zeta continues to independently and exhaustively cover corruption, abuses of power, organized crime, and in particular the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome, Adela. Ioan Grillo is an independent journalist in the United Kingdom and Mexico. In 2000, when Ioan moved from England to Mexico, he dreamed of working as a foreign correspondent in Latin America, covering guerrilla warfare and other conflicts that have so often affected the region. He ended up covering another kind of conflict, the so-called war on drugs, or drug war, which has caused hundreds of thousands of deaths, including the assassination of dozens of journalists in recent years. As a staff writer or freelance contributor to several prestigious American and European news outlets, Grillo has published more than 1,000 stories from Mexico and other Latin American countries over the last 2 decades. He also moved beyond day-to-day coverage, taking on in-depth investigative reporting from the front lines and long-form narratives, including 3 books and over 10 documentaries and docuseries. In 2021, Grillo published his 3rd book, Blood, Gun, Money: How America Arms Gangs and Cartels, after a 4-year-long investigation. He traveled to the United States to track, as he said in a New York Times article, this so-called iron river of guns, in an effort to understand why the United States and Mexico have so badly failed to stop it. Welcome, Ioan. Jennifer Avila is from Contracorriente. She's the co-founder and editor-in-chief of this digital publication in Honduras since 2017. She has previously been a documentary filmmaker and radio broadcaster in Honduras, as well as a fixture and freelancer for digital media outlets in Latin America and Europe. Contracorriente has grown into a dynamic multimedia website providing lucid, factual coverage of the country's troubles, from drug trafficking and criminal violence to environmental destruction and attacks on indigenous rights. Contracorriente probes the issues with well-honed reporting, holding the government to account despite grave risks to their journalists. In recent years, as despairing Hondurans fled by the thousands heading to the United States, Contracorriente filled a void, explaining the push factors and narrating the migrants' journeys. Welcome, Jennifer. Just one quick thing. There's an A missing in Ioan's Twitter. If either of you see another slight little mistake, please let me know. But in case you are tweeting out some of this, and please make that quick notation. Also, in asking these questions, I'll speak in English, but I would invite in this multilingual group the panelists to respond in whatever language they feel most comfortable. Adela, let's start with you. As of the last reporting, I believe at least 15 journalists have been killed in Mexico, which is an unfathomable number. With this constant threat, cartel activity and other threats, what considerations do you have to give to the timing of stories, how they are published, when you and your staff are working on a big story?
Muchas gracias a todos por estar acá y por invitarme a platicar con ustedes. Podría responder a esa pregunta en dos ámbitos, porque los periodistas en México estamos normalmente entre dos fuegos, entre las balas y las amenazas del narcotráfico y las presiones y las amenazas por parte del Estado mexicano a través de los gobiernos, sea el gobierno de la República o sea el gobierno de los estados. Podría decir lo que hemos hecho en el semanario Z para salvaguardar nuestra identidad, que es investigar cuando se trata de narcotráfico, de crimen organizado de los cárteles, confirmar la información con por lo menos 3 fuentes de diferentes órdenes o de participación, sea con instituciones o corporaciones policíacas, o sea con los gobiernos o con las Fuerzas Armadas del país. Y siempre que hacemos una revelación de un nombre, de una imagen de un criminal, de un mafioso que está siendo protegido por el Estado mexicano, y que el semanario Z lo está exhibiendo, que esta es la persona que le está haciendo daño a la sociedad, lo que hacemos es que firmamos nuestras notas como investigaciones Z. Es decir, es un reportero sin rostro hacia afuera para cuidarlo, para salvaguardar su integridad. Pero ¿qué podemos hacer cuando estamos criticando a un gobierno corrupto? Cuando estamos firmando nuestras notas con nuestros nombres, o el propio directorio aparece en nuestro semanario todos los viernes los nombres de todos quienes trabajamos en el semanario. Entonces es una situación muy complicada, ciertamente difícil. Los asesinatos de periodistas, particularmente en los últimos 3 años, han incrementado, y la impunidad en la investigación de estos asesinatos es caldo de cultivo para cometer más atrocidades contra periodistas en el país. Desde el semanario Z nosotros denunciamos y exigimos cada semana que se solucionen los crímenes, no solamente de mis compañeros que trabajaron en el semanario, que fueron asesinados, o de nosotros que estamos ahora encabezando el periódico y hemos recibido amenazas, sino de nuestros compañeros que a lo largo y ancho de la República Mexicana les han arrebatado la vida en el ejercicio de la libertad de expresión.
Sí, gracias. Staying in Mexico, Ioan, and I should say that number 15 journalists killed, that's just in 2022. That's just in the first 8 or 9 months. you have established a network of cartel chain sources and access that I know takes a long time and a lot of risk. How does the motivations of your sources factor into the reporting?
How do the motivations of the
Of the sources, yes, the people that you look to for information.
Yeah, hi there. Thanks. I mean, their motivation
To speak to you.
to speak and stuff. Yeah. Thanks much for the intro and the panel, and hey everybody. I hope everyone's doing well there. So talking to criminals and cartel members specifically, and it's something over years and years I've been doing and been developing over years. It's something, it's a long process. I mean, it took, something that took years to access, like you said. And first of all, often I spent time around things like drug rehab places, talking to people who are drug addicts and recovering and dealers, and then going into prisons and then reaching out. And as I publish books and start getting a name doing this, I start getting the criminals reaching out to me. So, for example, people from prison, inside prison, people coming out of prison. Every case is different. Every time you have to evaluate somebody and see, okay, how can we look at this testimony? How much public interest is there in this testimony? So to give, there's different things on the chain. So there's one thing is that I think a lot of journalists have done, and which was a big story and very useful some years ago, was talking to the hitmen, talking to people who carry out hits for murder and understanding how they work, how they operate, what's motivating them, how have they grown up into this. And they were good, and often these kind of hitmen are at the bottom level of the chain, and they're people who have suffered themselves, people who have come into this in difficult circumstances, who sometimes have a lot of hate inside. And then I think a lot of the time we've kind of in some ways done and made a lot of that, and sometimes now it's kind of useful to try and speak to more high-level people, which has a lot more complications. So, for example, recently where I've been talking to some quite high-level people from their prison cells, from prison and different communications, and it's obviously a lot hotter when you have high-level people. They're a lot smarter, they're a lot more powerful. Yeah. Now, in terms of the interest or how we should treat cartel sources, I think this has been evolving over the years as well. Like when initially you had like the wave of violence in 2008, 2009, when people were leaving like piles of decapitated heads and leaving messages and videos. And initially this was something that, I'm publishing mainly in foreign media, in American or British media or international media. But the same with the same kind of lessons were being learned in Mexican media, or we're publishing in foreign media. Like initially we're publishing these kind of things. Okay, you publish these messages, you publish these videos. But we realize, well, you're just simply giving a kind of voice out to the cartel sources in this way. So it's difficult of what the public interest is. But there certainly is, I think, a public interest in trying to understand these sources. I think we cannot possibly understand the violence in Mexico without talking to these sources. It is difficult, and in terms of a moral question, when people are, serial murderers, when people have committed horrific crimes. Yeah. Like, how can you treat and evaluate this source, and on what levels, So a lot of the time in some of my earlier works and what I was doing was trying to understand what was happening in Mexico, and trying to understand it's a human story and how come humans are committing these horrific acts. And what has a human being been through to do things like decapitate someone while they're still alive? Like, what led them to do that? How could they do that? When you get into the more complicated things about direct kind of corruption networks and these kind of things, as well, again, there's public interest. But obviously, with any sources, we have to take anything they say and look at it very, very heavily to try and evaluate that.
Yes, thank you. And this question, which, by the way, come directly from our students, I can't take credit for them, and they're wonderful questions. One of them reminds me very much of the message that our new dean, Jelani Cobb, has given to our students about making sure to contextualize stories in the history of a region and its people. So important in order to help readers understand. How have you tried to contextualize the subjects that you've covered in in terms of the history of Brazil, and how does that shape your priorities in the reporting that you do? How do you try to make sure that the stories that you report in Brazil are rooted in the history, contextualized in the history of that country and its people? And how does that help you in your decision making about what you will report and how you will report it?
Hi.
Especially, reporting on Bolsonaro and indigenous communities, so much there.
Sure. How many people speak Portuguese here? 2, 3. I think I will make an effort to talk in English. Then you need to have some patience to understand my bad English. Okay. I'd like to tell you that in September we launched a new platform, a new journalist platform called Sumauma. Sumauma is the biggest tree in the Amazon forest. The indigenous people used to say that it's the tree that connects the sky with the earth. And this platform is trilingual. It's Spanish, English, and Portuguese. You can check. It's sumauma.com. And you create this based in Altamira, the city where I choose to live, Altamira. It's the most dangerous city in the Amazon forest. It's a hotspot. It's the champion in deforestation, in fires, in death, in everything that is difficult, but it's also a hotspot of resistance. And this journalist platform is based in Altamira because we understand that in this moment that we are living, the climate crisis and the 6th mass extinction of species, the real center of the world is not New York or Washington or Berlin or London. The real central is the natural supports of life. How Amazon forest, the tropical forest in the world, the oceans, because it's where our lives like humans and the lives of the other species will be decided. And this is not rhetoric. And because it's not rhetoric, we made a trilingual platform based in the central of the world. Then it's Sumauma, journalism of the center of the world. And our idea, our work is to write, to cover the Amazon, Brazil, and the world from the perspective of the forest people. It's to invert, to look to the world from the forest. Because I'm journalist for almost 35 years, and I covered the Amazon for more than 25 years. But it was totally different when I began to live since 2017, to live in the Amazon. I could understand things that I couldn't understand before. Yeah. And then our perspective, we cover climate crisis, crossing for the fundamental questions, the gender, race, class, and of course species, because we don't understand the concept of democracy for the human is very limited. We need to understand democracy, to extend democracy for the other species in this time, or no makes sense. It doesn't make sense. Well, I say this, we are trying, we are doing this, and I would like you check our work. Yeah. We are doing this in a very terrible moment, the most terrible moment of the history of the controversial democracy in Brazil, that is Bolsonaro. Very similar to Trump, that you know very well. and Bolsonaro can re-elect. He had 51 million votes last weekend. We have a second round in the end of this month. At this moment, the Amazon forest is it's very close to the point of no return, and if the Amazon forest how can I say search the point of no return, there isn't a possibility to handle the climate crisis. And this is not about us Brazilians, it's about you. For all this reason, because it's a climate crisis and the world is connected and the world depends on the Amazon forest, but also because the forest is destroyed because the consuming the United States and Europe. It's where the wood, where many things. And I would like to say, what is this? I will read a very short, don't worry about it. I will finish it. This is one of the stories that we'll publish tomorrow in Suma Uma. And it's an article written by a black woman, a peasant leader, a quilombola, that it's a descendant of rebel slaves. And he began her article saying this: "My name is Natalia Teófilo, and I am a refugee in my own country. I am quilombola, 33 years old, a black feminist, human rights activist, and forest defender. I am part of the forest people. I am writing to you from exile, to which I was condemned along with my husband, the peasant leader Erasmo Teófilo, and our 4 young children. Our exile is not in Paris, London, New York, or Berlin. Our exile is inside Brazil, where we are hiding so a bullet doesn't blow off our heads or those of our children. That is how we spent the first round of this election, hiding so we aren't killed. When we saw the results, we were pained to know 51 million Brazilians voted for the one who condemned us to the horror of living with a target on our heads for defending the Amazon." And this is the situation. We have a lot of people in this situation. In September, in the before the election, 7 indigenous people were killed. In the less than 3 months, just in the Yanomami people, 6 children died from very basic disease because the indigenous lands are invaded for illegal miners. 2 of these children died vomiting worms. They died because worms. They didn't medicine for worms. At this moment, the Munduruku, other big indigenous people in Brazil, don't know how to do, because the mercury is it's in the milk of the breasts of the indigenous mothers, and it's in the fish that is the base of the food. I can tell you many things, but I don't like. It's too much. Thank you.
Yes, it is a complex and broad story, and I'm sure that some students will want to ask you about living there and how, just logistically these stories come to the world. But let me move to Javier for a moment. This is a familiar trope around the world, attacks on the press. How, amidst the many different ways that journalists and journalism has been attacked, what approaches do you use to help maintain the trust in journalism and media with your readers?
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. That's really the hard part, the part trust. I would divide in 2 parts. The first one is, how do you keep trust within the newsroom, within journalistic community? Because in many cases, when newsrooms are under attack and when journalists are under attack, it's very difficult to maintain cohesion and solidarity between colleagues. There are more and more, fortunately, in Mexico, collectives and groups that are getting together to denounce and to pressure for justice in the cases of attacks against journalists. But when you have a group of people working together in a newsroom, to get them on the same page in terms of safety measures is very hard. So that is one part, I think, that has been learned more and more, is how to trust each other, and that you are taking the necessary measures to protect yourselves as a newsroom. And then the other part is, of course, how do you maintain trust, the public's trust in the media? It's no secret in Mexico, as it is no secret in the United States, that the media in general is losing credibility. But there is a large sector of the public still that turns its eyes to certain news organizations to inform them. And I think what I learned this in covering violence. I think I also learned this during the pandemic. Whenever fake news starts circulating, which in moments of acute social or societal stress and uncertainty and fear, there is more fertile ground for fake news and for everybody wanting to put out junk out there for their own purposes. People eventually learn to turn to trusted sources to verify and to, maybe not at first, maybe on the first occasions they will sort of fall for the fake tweet or the fake news story that is circulating, but eventually they might come around to realizing that they need to turn to a trusted source to check. It's important then for journalists to try to, how do you establish yourself as that source? In some cases, a news organization that is under attack establishes a lot of credibility. I'm not saying that you need to get attacked to establish credibility, but in some cases, that is how you know who to turn to. And I think also journalists in that situation have a big opportunity to show the public what they would miss if a news organization didn't exist. What they would be missing. They would be missing important stories about the pulse of the community. If anything, for example, they would be missing information about what parts of the city they live in are the most violent. What parts of the city are the ones where you have the most robberies, for example. What parts of the city are the ones that have the worst public services or whatever. In the middle of the violence against the media, I think more and more in Mexico, and I think also in other countries, news organizations are trying to tell the public, we exist for a reason, and there would be a huge thing that you would be missing if we didn't exist. It doesn't always work. It don't necessarily get the community to support you in that way. But in my experience, as editor of a newspaper that came under attack several times over the course of 7 years, we did see shows of solidarity from the public and saying, you are doing an important work, and even some people that say, well, how can we help? I think that is how you establish your credibility. It builds on reporting. I think here Adela can speak to this better than I can, because of the long trajectory of SETA, for example, establishing itself report after report after report as the only place where you would turn if you want to learn about corruption in Tijuana or in the state of Baja California. Then you would know that is the place that you turn. And living in a climate of violence makes that very hard, but it also makes that a bigger responsibility for the journalists who are tasked with that. It's in many cases, even today, or probably more so today, it's very easy to be a journalist in a way. Everybody can go out in the street and tweet what's going on. But what really distinguishes you is how you go about in letting people know that what you are giving them is the most accurate and the most interesting and important information that they need to know.
Yes. Jennifer, how do you monitor the relationship between U.S. mining industries and conflict on the ground? And are there major, what are the safety considerations in doing that work?
Well, searching for or looking for environmental conflicts in mining and other extractive industries, because also in Honduras there's a lot of corruption in oil palm.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, oil palm, mining, dams. And the thing is that when you go in those territories, you see that there's no institutionality there, and these big enterprises and these transnational businesses are like they became the state institutions. They put a hospital in the community. They build a church. They build the schools, and that's really awful because people don't have these basic rights in their communities. They have been forgotten for all these years, for decades, and then these mining companies or these big transnational businesses, they come and give them these small gainings, like the small school or the small hospital, and people get to accept what they are getting. They're just getting all the material, and they're exploiting the territories, and they're making the community division, and they are killing leaders in the communities, but nobody is going to hear their voices. So it's very, very difficult to get into those territories because people don't trust journalists, or they don't trust any institutionality. They only trust themselves or the mining company. And there's a lot of division and violence also in there because the businesses, they're not interested in the development of the communities. They're interested in division and the violence, so they can just go there and extract all the resources. And Honduras is a very rich country. It's very nice. It has a lot of forests and beaches, and we have access to both of the oceans, and we have a lot of resources. But we have a very weak state institutionality for defending people. We have a very strong institutionality for mafias and narco trafficking and everything, but not for taking care of the citizens. We also have a very poor population. We are one of the poorest countries in Latin America. So people is not empowered on their citizens' situation. They're just people trying to survive. So it's very hard to report on these conditions because people they feel alone. They don't feel nobody is going to protect them. They're only going to be people in a very rich territory, and people is going to go extract whatever there is.
Yeah.
So yes, I think it's hard to report that because of the violence, but because of the people, they don't trust anybody there, and they feel very alone and abandoned in that places. So transnational businesses, they are just getting advantage of the weak institutionality of our countries to protect people.
Yes. Adela, I know this question will be asked by students, but I want to ask, with the government and the police and their known ties to cartels, what are the resources that you have to look to, if any, to keep your family and yourself safe?
Sí, bueno, aparte de las decisiones editoriales que hemos tomado para proteger a mis compañeros y a sus familias de ataques, sí hemos en ciertos momentos de nuestra carrera, por ejemplo, yo tengo 32 años haciendo periodismo, y de esos 32 años, en 13 he tenido que estar custodiada por una escolta oficial ante las amenazas que he recibido. Entonces no han sido momentos fáciles, pero a veces ha sido necesario, por ejemplo, contar con una seguridad. La última vez que recibimos una amenaza por parte de un cártel de las drogas en Tijuana fue en el 2017. Estuvimos nosotros publicando una serie de reportajes evidenciando cómo una célula del cártel Jalisco Nueva Generación, con alianzas corruptas con las fiscalías locales y federales, estaba creciendo el negocio ilícito de la droga y estaba asesinando personas en el camino. Decidieron que, como no saben quién está escribiendo la información, porque dice investigaciones Z, dijeron, vamos a volar el periódico. Entonces planearon acabar con las instalaciones del semanario. Durante unos meses en que duró investigación, después de que nosotros denunciamos esta amenaza contra nuestras instalaciones, hubo unas patrullas estacionadas frente a las oficinas de Z, protegiéndonos a todos quienes trabajamos ahí. Esto fue en el 2017. Hace un par de meses me llega un oficio de la Fiscalía General de la República donde nos informan que ya prescribió el delito de amenazas y que no van a ejercer acción penal contra esta persona que nos amenazó. Es decir, no investigaron lo suficiente, no lograron los elementos como para consignarlo. Entonces, esta impunidad que nos demuestra la Fiscalía General de la República en este caso, atrae a otros a amenazar a periodistas, porque no pasa nada si amenazas a un periodista en México, no pasa nada si asesinas a un periodista en México. Entonces, más allá de las cuestiones que podamos hacer para cuidar nuestra identidad al momento de estar investigando con nuestros contactos, con nuestras fuentes sobre el narcotráfico, la corrupción, el crimen organizado, también nos cuidamos físicamente, con cursos, con policías, con oficiales, con medidas de seguridad, ¿no?
Privados.
Así es.
Sí. Eliane, in contrast to these type of threats, what are the unique dangers or risks of being a journalist in the Amazon in Brazil?
We have, in these last years, we have some journalists killed in the cities of the Amazon. This year, as you know, we had something different, another level of violence when the British journalist Dom Phillips, who was my friend, and an indigenist, Bruno Pereira, were killed in June in the deep forest. This marked some different point because it was the first death in the deep forest. The other deaths were in the cities of the Amazon. In the deep forest were the first. This shows how safe the organized crime is feeling, because Bolsonaro, our president, is stimulating the crimes in the Amazon. His base is in the Amazon is formed by criminals, and people knows that nothing will happen with them, and then they make the violence reach other level that these two deaths proved, and how the narco traffic is inside the forest. Nowadays, almost entire forest, Amazon forest in Brazil, that has 60% of the Amazon in the territory, is with narco traffic in many points. And also shows that how part of the forest people, not only indigenous but other, we have many kind of forest people in the Amazon, are involved because they don't have alternative. These were worst with the pandemic, because in the pandemic, journalists stopped to cover because it could be a risk for the indigenous people because the COVID. The NGOs stopped to act in the Amazon, but the criminals didn't stop. And then this forced people discover themselves more vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And then some of them were obliged to be involved with these criminals. That the situation nowadays is much serious. If Bolsonaro was reelected, we don't know how we will live. I live with some threats, but the threats that I live is much smallest than the people that I covered. These people is in the front line, and these people are hiding, or they are in this entire year. The houses were burned, the schools were burned, everything were burned, and many people were killed.
Yeah.
And these people are much more threatened than me. And we understand that you are in a war, the war against nature, and this is a global war against nature. And we see and then we act like journalists in a front line of a war, a much longer war, and much more difficult to win. And you are losing this war. Mm-hmm. We are losing, and it's not a war, it's a massacre, because the disproportion of the forces is huge. That's it.
Yes. Jan, do you find that there are benefits to collaboration in cross-border investigations, and if so, in what ways?
Yeah, sure. So, like with Mexico, it's very interesting. A lot of news organizations are very territorial. In terms of people working in the same organizations become very territorial. So sometimes, for example, I remember this, I've worked in the Associated Press, and you get like a San Diego bureau person and Tijuana bureau person, mm-hmm. and they're both kind of protecting their things of the stories. But the thing about the story right now of Mexico and the United States, it's so intertwined. There's so many ways you can follow these things between different places. I mean, not only in the border areas where it's kind of going right across literally a physical border, but some of these stories are kind of leading across places so much. So you can find, for example, you have, in Mexico, a criminal organization operating, and then that money you trace through to the United States, or these drugs. If you're looking at the issue of fentanyl now, right, a huge issue in the United States with the fentanyl epidemic. Mm-hmm. We can't understand this without what's happening in Mexico, and then what's happening in China. So the world is like so globalized, and so many of these stories are connected that we can't understand them without coming together. And as you mentioned, I've been doing this long investigation about the gun trafficking from the United States into Mexico. And there's another area, this is, you have the issue of guns in the United States, and you have the issue of guns being trafficked to war zones around the world. And a lot of the time, these organizations, and the policies trying to, these are separate issues. So, like, you've got guns in the US cities is a domestic issue. Guns in Syria is kind of international. We'll kind of put these apart. Mm-hmm. But you cannot separate those right now with what's happening in Mexico. If you look at the guns being trafficked to Baltimore, Maryland, or to New York City, right here to New York City, a lot of the illegal guns on the streets of New York City, they're coming in, and these ways that people are acquiring these weapons, so they call them straw buyers, somebody being paid with a clean record to go and buy a gun. people avoiding gun checks with private sale loopholes. Those being used to bring the guns here into New York City, and they're carrying out murders here in New York City, murders in the streets close to here. And exactly the same methods are used to acquire guns and take those guns down into Mexico and commit mass murder there. So these issues are completely combined. And as much as sometimes we kind of try and see, I mean, in some ways the solutions have to come apart with national governments, because national governments have power. And kind of international, it's hard, it's a network of journalists to have kind of power, but we have to see and show those connections. We cannot understand it or look for the solutions without seeing them.
Before opening it up to the students, a question for you, Javier, and for you, Jennifer. What are the challenges facing independent news outlets in Latin America? The challenges facing independent news organizations in Latin America.
Well, the challenge, I think, mainly is economic. As the challenge of the whole news media, in Latin America, in the world, is economic. But in the case of independent organizations, I'm sorry, is even more so, because you might categorize the traditional news media in Latin America as, on the one hand, the business conglomerates, whether they are the big national chains or the local business groups that control news organizations in medium-sized cities, for example. You have public news organizations, and then you have independent, which are usually not non-profit collectives that are trying to break that mold. The main threat for the large conglomerates is, of course, the business model is dying, and they have less and less commercial advertisement. In the case of Mexico, the remedy for the loss of commercial advertisement for the vast majority of business news of conglomerates or businesses that own news organizations has been government advertisement. And as you depend more and more on government advertisement, your ability to expose corruption in that government diminishes. So that is, I think, the huge challenge for journalists is either you go down the path in that model. You can still do some important journalism, community journalism within that model. It's just that you have stricter limits, or you have more narrower limits. And this is, leaving aside the whole violence against the media from the drug cartels or from the public officials. There are journalists trying to break free of that model and then setting up independent news organizations that do not depend on large business conglomerates, or to try not to depend on government advertisement, or that try to depend on a mix of commercial advertisement, crowdfunding, grants, financial support from international organizations, and you're seeing an increasing trend going into that area. That's usually digital.
Right.
It's more flexible, more nimble news organizations. They are not burdened with heavy production costs like a newspaper, for example. A newspaper, the large amount of its income has to go to sustaining a printing press and a labor plant that is very cumbersome. So these news organizations are trying to be more agile, more flexible. They need less money, but of course there is less money to go around. So the main challenge, I think, is how do you tap into income sources in order to sustain independent journalism?
Right. Right, and same question for you, Jennifer. And what do you think is the role of the international journalism community in continuing the sustainability?
Yes, I think it's a big challenge to find the money to make investigative journalism, because it's expensive, and especially if we are in violent countries reporting things that are not easy or that are not safe. It's more expensive, and we have a big responsibility also with the team of young journalists that want to tell stories in a different way. So it's really expensive and it's really hard to find. We are a digital media just because it's cheaper, but we have this big issue that Honduras is a very small country. We have a very deep gap, digital gap. A lot of people don't have access to internet, so we have a very weak relation with the audience. We don't have like massive audience because of that, also because we are only online, and that's not good in a very small country, or even in Central America. We're a very small region with no internet access, full access. So that's a very difficult thing that we have to like deal with every day. We're like making all these big investigations and trying to put them in other media in Latin America. We work a lot with other media in Latin America and the United States. We work a lot with collaborative projects because of that, because we think we need like an echo outside so people inside can also consume the news or the investigations we're making. We have been like in 12 or 13 collaborative projects in Latin America and the United States because of that, because digital is so limited in our country and in our region. And also that how can we make a relationship with the audience that's different from the massive media? We have been also making offline events and trying to understand how people is consuming media in social media and also in the internet, and how they see us as journalists and how they feel treated by us. So it's a very like small work, with groups in the communities and how they feel with the coverage we're making, and trying to make discussions offline, so with people that are directly impacted by corruption or extractive projects or gender violence, etc. And that's how we try to build an audience, because what we have seen here in Central America is that we see that the audience is very authoritarian governments are very popular. So we are fighting against this narrative, this authoritarian narrative that is in social media a lot, like Trump or Bolsonaro, but it's also in Central America with Bukele in El Salvador, and now in Honduras too. Yeah. So we're fighting against this big machine of political propaganda and authoritarian speech that are very popular in communities and in countries that lacks of education and lacks of rights, like basic rights, and lacks of democracy. We don't know what's that. Starting from there. So we try to make this like close relation with the audience. We know that we're very limited in competition of the big and massive media, and I think that's like the my everyday nightmare. How can I reach? How can I connect with people? Because at the end, in this difficult time, we're covering authoritarian governments, corrupt governments, narco state, whatever, and we need that people to protect us. The audience to protect us. They, as Javier said, we want them to know that we are necessary to build democracy, and democracy is important to build, and it's a very long path we have. But audience and the media, we need to work together, and we need audience to protect us in our work. So yes, I think that's like a big challenge. It is also expensive, and we don't have money. But yes, I think that's one. And the other one, at least in Honduras, we have this big challenge with journalism schools. We, in Contracorriente, we say that we are reporting stories, but at the same time, we are like a school for new journalists to watch different a different way to see how to tell stories and how to contextualize and how to understand the country we're telling, because that's the first step. Sometimes journalists just cover and they don't understand what they're covering, and even local journalists. So that's a very big issue. But then is the ethic issue, you know? In our countries, the big media has been based in a corrupt business model. You know, they just react, or they cover around the biggest payer. You know, it could be the government or the big business or whatever, but not searching the truth, or not given or not making a reporting responsible with the victims, and trying to teach people that are new journalists that we can tell stories differently. We can be more responsible with our sources. We can be more responsible with the audience, and more especially, we can be more responsible, and we have a commitment with victims. That's very difficult. In Contracorriente, we don't want to be, I don't want to be only journalists, you know? We want to be a very good and big team of journalists that understand how to tell stories different and in a more ethic way. And it is also a big job how to tell people, or how to teach this kind of journalism, and how to teach people or journalists, new journalists, in an ethic path of how doing this job. So that's like all
Very
the
well
issues
said,
we need
yes.
to face.
No, that's a wonderful way to kind of, open the discussion, because it really illustrates that even among these distinct countries with these distinct histories and languages and experiences, that this common experience of dealing with authoritarian governments, with cartel violence and other threats, unites journalists in the challenges that they face, and also gives a sense of the importance of telling our own stories, and of helping to broaden this community of journalists around the world who understand these issues and can work together to make them happen. Are there questions that you'd like to pose to anyone, or to all of our panelists? Is that mic on?
Hello, thank you so much for being here, and it's nice to see you. I will have to rush off to investigative techniques, but I just didn't want to miss the chance to ask you a question. So in terms of what supports can be offered from the international community of journalists in order to sustain the work that you are doing?
Javier, would you like to?
What can you offer in order to sustain what?
What supports can be offered from the international community of journalists in order to sustain the work that you are doing?
Well, that's a good question. I think that from my experience, in the case of Mexican journalists covering a story that has a big international repercussion, is I think the main contribution from the international community is exposure. As you talk more and more about what is going on with journalists in Mexico and Latin America, I think in general, but the peril that is that they're in, and the precarious situation that they're in, you get a lot more people interested, people who can be in a position to help, whether it is international organizations pressuring governments to actually do something and end the impunity that Adela was talking about, to, for example, foundations giving grants and financial support to journalists that really want to make a difference in exposing corruption or abuse or environmental crimes or whatever. So I think that comes mostly from the foreign or the media worldwide paying attention to what's going on. Although I would say that in the latter years, at least in terms of the exposure that can pressure authorities to actually do something, I think sadly it's becoming more and more ineffective, because governments, as they become more authoritarian and more self-centered, they don't really care about, when they see that there is a political cost for violence against journalists, they stop caring. And because nothing happens, then they don't see any need to actually do something about it. But that doesn't mean that the pressure needs to relent. I think it needs to keep going.
Thank you.
I want to answer that also. I think in Contracorriente about collaborative networks that has been very useful, and in Contracorriente we also have Contracorriente English for the audience in other parts of the world, and a lot of people in the United States and Europe have been like volunteering in Contracorriente to translate into English, or to put these discussions into universities or into think tanks, and that's very useful also because of the echo we need, because we're very small. But sometimes collaborative networks also make us to understand better corruption networks or money laundering things. You know, there's a lot of money laundering in the United States. We are also, in Honduras, we're also very interested in understanding the court cases here in the Southern District of New York, because we have our ex-president here, you know. And we have been a lot, we have had volunteers here from Colombia also, and other university trying to read these court cases and understand how can we make collaborative networks, because we are talking about transnational crimes. We're talking about transnational businesses. We're talking about money laundering, and this is connected with the US finances system, and also Europe and Switzerland and everything. So I think we need to see us more, not only like Central America as a region, but also like a world, you know, and we can work together a lot, and also there's a lot of money here in foundations and interest in putting money into independent investigative journalism. So it could be great to, well, it's great this discussion right now, so.
Yeah, and particularly as it relates to the safeguarding of democracy.
Yes, I'd like to add also, because it's not about us, as she said, it's about you. The most of the crimes that are happening in the Amazon and the other place in Latin America is beginning here. And what they call research is consuming here. In my region, the region where I live, there is a river that the Xingus River, one of the most big rivers in the Amazon River Basin, is totally threatened by Canadian miners, and this is happening in the entire Amazon and the entire Latin America. And then it's about you because this, and it's about you because you depend. In the case, you depend on the Amazon forest if you want to live.
Yeah, of course.
Then for us, it's very important we read Suma Umes in 3 languages, because we want to be the people read and spread the message and be involved and make community for us, because the capitalism destroyed the community, the idea of community. And the only chance of us to have a future is to rebuild the communities. Then this is a big collaboration if you can do.
Yes.
Thanks so much for your time tonight. This has been fascinating. Earlier, we heard about the challenges of working with sources who have committed horrific crimes, and I wanted to ask about the other side, how you work with the victims of the crimes, and how you work with them to tell their story in a way that isn't re-traumatizing.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, with the, so, you know, in Mexico, you can see the numbers of like 300,000 murders in the last year in Mexico. And that's 300,000 families. Many, as well as many of the victims being people involved. And initially, when a lot of the violence escalated, there was an idea, oh, it's bad guys killing bad guys. And then that was really established. It was not the case, that many, many innocent people were being murdered. And you had these mass graves, it being found with people, and many people with horrific stories. And these numbers again can mean nothing compared to each individual story. Just to give example of one story of a mother in Monterrey, that I met her after covering 49 bodies that have been dumped near Monterrey, a place called Cadereyta, all been decapitated, all had their hands and feet cut off. And they take it back to the morgue in Monterrey, and there was a bunch of people outside trying to find their loved ones who had disappeared, including a mother who was a school teacher and was trying to find her 18-year-old son. And he was an 18-year-old philosophy student. So somebody, a student at university, who was dragged out of her house by a group of armed men who had stormed in the house. And she was trying to find him and couldn't find him. So in terms of talking about that, and from her point of view, and I think for many of these people, they actually want to tell their stories. They wanted to get it out. They've been traumatized so much already. However, there is a certain privacy you have to respect. And remember one time, and there was a funeral of a child who died migrating. And they were having the funeral there. The mother, the dad had taken the kid away. They died on the border. And there's like cameras in their face at the funeral. It's like sometimes you've got to show some respect. Another time, filming in Sinaloa, the state of Sinaloa, which is a kind of cradle of Mexican drug trafficking. And I was at a scene where there was 5 bodies that had been murdered. And a family were there. The family, I would hear them, they were pretty angry. They were like plotting revenge right there. And a film crew was like getting the camera in the face of the father right there when his son's on the ground. And these are kind of things that like lines to respect. But yeah, the victims' voices have to get out. I mean, I think they have got out, but they need to get out more and more. And the people suffering, to understand the humanity, the human story of this tragedy, I mean, they have to get out there, but with due respect.
I would add something. I think there is a growing awareness of that. Unfortunately, it's not something that we had in mind, especially when we began to cover the drug war about 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. There was, historically, we usually attached the stigma to anybody that, for example, was killed in circumstances resembling drug cartel-related violence. For journalists was, well, he was into something, right? As in saying, he deserved it in a way. So we sort of dismissed it as, that's not worthy, that's not a story worth following up. That's not a life worth examining, how he was killed, what kind of life he lived. Did he have a family? Does he have a mother? Because we usually criminalized that kind of people. And when we covered violence, whether it was organized crime or not, reporters usually cover, let's say, accidents or brawls that might have left some people killed, and usually in the most insensitive way. I mean, I literally once saw a reporter going up to a woman and say, well, your son was just killed in an accident. How do you feel? More and more in the past, I think, decade and a half, we have learned how to deal with that, because we have seen that many people have been dragged into this violence. And for example, an armed group goes in, storms in, and shoots at a bar indiscriminately, killing 20 people. And those people there, they weren't members of a cartel, or they weren't in anything. It's becoming harder and harder for us to rationalize as, the old saying that, well, he was into something. That's not the case anymore. It's not the case when a 5-year-old child gets killed in a crossfire, for example, or in things like that have happened increasingly in Mexico. So we have become more sensitized to the fact that a lot of people are losing, and that a lot of lives are being lost, and that is worth exploring. Mm-hmm. How do we explore it? That's the other challenge. I think, well, Colombia here has one of the greatest resources at the DART Center, which is really how they've taught many journalists. And how do you approach people who have been traumatized, and not go to the mother of a man who just been killed and saying, how do you feel, right? I think more and more we're learning. It's still a process. There's still some really insensitive ways of reporting this, but I think we're learning bit by bit.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for coming. I just have a question about how what you are all dealing with can be more easily read and understood by us here, because I don't remember exactly when, but I'd seen the New York Times has done a profile on like different apartments owned by certain different corrupt, so like kind of tracking the money in our city here in New York, and I understood the example about the guns, but is there any type of collaboration between the work that you're doing in your countries and the money that's flowing into our city, the money that obviously our news organizations have here, the ability to kind of bring that to light? I mean, I'm here with some people. We're at the climate school, so we're not in journalism, but we learned this thing. I don't particularly believe that it works much, but naming and shaming, that's how they're doing climate negotiations at this point, apparently. But to a certain degree, I mean, here I think many times we run into people, or we might even have neighbors who might be a part of this. And is there, how could that, is it being done? Is there room for that? What do you,
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I think there always is. I mean, first there's the links, and you always find more and more links, and there's always room to connect these links. I mean, there's so many things. And these days with organized crime and international organized crime, you can find these things. So we have, for example, the issue of avocados, right? Avocados massively consumed in the United States, very popular on game day. There's a deal made so only one state in Mexico had the license for all the avocados exported to the United States, then became massive cartel ownership of avocados, so like a huge link there. I don't think avocados, there should be a boycott on avocados, just an example of how this kind of link is made. But so many things. I mean, obviously with the drug addicts, and so many products all the time, these cross-border things, cars, economic chains, money, and there's so many things. But also in terms of just bringing the stories home, I think it's always important. I mean, when people are looking at foreign news, it can seem kind of far away, but sometimes these things could often just be brought back to people in, say, like ways. How do you try and bring and try and explain to Americans, or explain to British people, or explain to French people or Germans, okay, what's going on? With the issue of drugs and violence, it's kind of easier than some other things because people can relate to kind of drugs and gangs and violence. They can at least have a perception of that. It's not as foreign sometimes trying to understand like radical Islam or something in Iraq or something, or Syria. It's kind of, these are kind of issues that people kind of understand, these kind of street situations in their own countries, drug dealing. People who've grown up and have some kind of contact with that, and then kind of relate to that kind of going down on in Mexico. So there's always room to try and bring these stories. So all these personalities are here. You suddenly find right across the United States, people linked to Mexican cartels. It's a very, very much a cross-border story.
Yeah, this week I saw a story about the seizure of thousands, tens of thousands of fentanyl pills here on the streets of New York City, and they had the pills laid out. They talked about the sting. The police chief made a statement, and as a journalist, you wonder, where do those pills come from? How were they transported? What did the police know? What can they reveal? Even if it's after the conviction of the person that they nabbed and her associates, it's still quite informative for an audience to know, even though this may be a particular, a different part of the world. The point is, when you see stories like that, to dig a little deeper than than that performance, and find some connections to these countries that are afflicted so much by this business.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. My name is Yana Sun, and I'm from China. I have two questions. One is also related to the source. So have any of you ever encountered that your source undergo like personal threat because they're giving out their story to journalists, and how could like journalists better protect our source from any like personal threat they might have? And another of my question is about like combating with major narrative in a country or by government, like how journalism could better do that.
Go first. First, in terms of protecting sources, it's a big deal. I think for me personally, many times we're putting the sources in huge danger. Now, I happen to have interviewed or talked to quite a lot of people who have been murdered. In Honduras, in Jennifer's country, I interviewed an anti-drug czar there in 2009. I interviewed him on a Thursday. On the following Tuesday, he was murdered. I've interviewed lawyers, cartel members, all kinds of people. It's a constant challenge. I mean, you have to think their life is more important than the story. You have to try and be that they're comfortable with what you're going to say. Sometimes they're going to put themselves in danger, but are they aware of it? So it's extremely challenging, and something that we have to always think about. At the same time, we have to do journalism, and can't get to the point. Now, I'm totally in favor, obviously, of using anonymous things all the time. And when it's anonymous, though, you got to think about, you can't give them away. It's going to be difficult sometimes with an anonymous source. You can start betraying them now. If it's on camera and you've got somebody covered, but then again, little things can give them away. Some people, and this is real cases. I know, that somebody's been like, they see a TV thing where the source is hidden, and they notice a photo in the back, or they notice even a cross the person's got, and people notice it, and that person, there was a case of two gang members in prison in Mexico. It wasn't my interview, but it was TV Azteca in Mexico, and they were murdered like the following day after they gave the interview to TV companies. So it's so difficult, such a challenge there. We're never going to get it 100% right, but it's something we always have to think about and try and work and support. And very quickly about combating the main narratives. I think partly, it's combating narratives, but I think you've got to search for truth. I think it's a big thing about, okay, what's our job as a journalist? Sometimes if we get too much carried away about this narrative and that narrative, it's like, what is the truth? What is happening? And what is the story? If we're looking, for example, right now there's a story on the southern border. There's huge amounts of people crossing the southern border. There's a huge amount of people asking for asylum, and there's a huge amount of people crossing illegally. And we get to narratives, and there's a big narrative warfare about this because this could affect, it's an issue in the election. But as a journalist, what is the fact? What is the truth of what's happening? And I think that that probably provides a certain thing. Yeah.
Adela, ¿quieres decir algo sobre el riesgo de las fuentes de información y la manera en que tratan de protegerlos?
Well, when you do investigative journalism, you have to interview as many people as you can, and that's a way to protect each other, because you have to protect your source. We at CETA have to confirm the information with 3 different sources, so no one's know who was the original source.
Okay. Yes.
I just add that it's hard enough what Ioan and Adela were saying about how to use anonymous sources for information that you are using. I think the two cares there is protecting the source, and on the other hand, making sure that he's giving you information and not opinion, because it's very easy to attribute opinion to an anonymous source. But what I found is harder than that is protecting the source and protecting the information, because sometimes you speak to sources who give you information that you cannot use, that is mostly for your own context. Even if not for things that you're working, but for example, I usually talk with military officers or police commanders about what's going on, so to know maybe, you know, if things are getting worse, if violence in the city where I live is probably on the uprise, or where are the main threats coming from. And I can't tell anybody who I'm speaking with, and I can't tell anybody what I'm speaking with them about. So those conversations, you have to also be very careful not to let it slip in the information that you are publishing or printing or broadcasting, that you are also handling that, and that sometimes is really, really difficult.
Thank you.
Hola, gracias a todos por estar acá. Ha sido súper interesante escucharlos. Y quería hacer una pregunta, bueno, directamente, yo vengo de Venezuela. Quería hacer una pregunta a la señora Navarro, pero creo que cualquiera de ustedes se puede identificar con esto. Hace un momento estaban explicando algunas de las dificultades que todos los periodistas, o la mayoría de los periodistas investigativos en Latinoamérica tienen preservando su seguridad física, la de sus familiares, la de las fuentes. Pero ahora, cuando estaba mencionando el tema de salvaguardar la información que se tiene, ¿qué tipo de estrategias utilizan, sobre todo cuando los recursos económicos son tan limitados, para proteger esa información que tienen, para utilizar VPNs si el medio es únicamente digital y es la única forma de que las audiencias conozcan lo que está pasando, ya sea por software, porque algunos de ustedes dicen, no, es bueno que complementes tus conocimientos de periodismo con el manejo de programación o de algún otro tipo de herramientas. ¿Qué tipo de estrategias me podrían dar para proteger esa información?
Pero tú estás elaborando un programa, ¿no? Para eso, para proteger la información.
Bueno, la seguridad digital, digo, si quieres tú primero.
Adelante. Es que Javier está trabajando un proyecto para guardar la información. Muy interesante.
La seguridad digital es algo que se está volviendo cada vez más importante para los periodistas, no nada más para los periodistas, para cualquier persona que está cada vez más poniendo la vida en los teléfonos celulares y en los aparatos, pero para un periodista con mucho más razón, en todas sus dimensiones, o sea, cómo proteges tus comunicaciones, cómo proteges los lugares en donde almacenas tus archivos, cómo proteges tu navegación para que nadie se dé cuenta de cuáles son las páginas que están navegando en internet, cómo utilizas tus redes sociales, tus dispositivos, etcétera. La otra parte que se me hace muy interesante desde el punto de vista colaborativo son las distintas iniciativas que están saliendo para colaborar en poner la información en un lugar seguro al que ciertas personas puedan tener acceso, con dos finalidades. Una puede ser para que mucha gente abreve de ahí y la saque, que es un poco lo que hizo la Red Internacional de Periodistas de Investigación con los Panama Papers. O sea, los consiguen, los ponen en un sitio web y le dan un acceso restringido y muy selecto a personas que saben que son confiables, ¿no? Aquí está, y para que le saques lo que te interesa. Y la otra parte, que es lo que está haciendo, por ejemplo, Forbidden Stories, es cómo continúas el trabajo de un periodista que fue censurado. Por ejemplo, el proyecto Miroslava, en el caso de Miroslava Bridge en Chihuahua, una periodista asesinada, pues estaba exponiendo ella nexos criminales en la Sierra Tarahumara de Chihuahua, de narcos y políticos. La matan, pero hay un colectivo de periodistas que logra continuar ese trabajo y exponer ya lo que ella no tuvo oportunidad. Entonces, la tecnología está haciendo cada vez más fácil este tipo de iniciativas, pero una cosa que es bien importante, que se regresa un poco a la tema de la confianza, es a quién le das el acceso, cómo se van generando estas redes de confianza de periodistas que pueden avalarse unos a otros y decir, en esta persona confío para que si algo me pasa, por ejemplo, continúe mi trabajo.
Yo creo que con el tema de complementar los conocimientos, también con el tema de proteger, nosotros trabajamos con ICJ justamente y aprendimos un montón, pero claro, o sea, el factor de inseguridad es la persona al final. No podemos tener todas las herramientas de seguridad digital, correos cifrados, lugares cifrados donde ponemos información. Nosotros trabajamos con ICJ para Pandora Papers y éramos más de 500 personas con acceso a eso, ¿no? Trabajamos con CLIP, con el Centro Latinoamericano de Investigación Periodística, somos menos, pero también tenemos un espacio seguro, pero aún así, ¿no? Digamos, la vulnerabilidad somos las personas, eso en primer lugar. Pero luego el tema de tener tecnólogos en los medios o en los proyectos es sumamente importante, ¿no? O sea, yo no sé cómo diseñaron esos espacios seguros porque no los hicimos los periodistas, los hicieron expertos tecnólogos. Pero luego también cómo los periodistas creamos herramientas para abrir información, para minar información también, ¿no? Y eso no lo podemos hacer nosotros, podemos tener el criterio. Digamos, en Contracorriente tenemos un sitio que se llama Abriendo Datos y minamos información y transformamos información para que sean datos abiertos, pero eso, yo tengo el criterio de qué información hacerlo, pero los tecnólogos son los que lo hacen, ¿no? Y hacen que la herramienta sea fácil de usar para la ciudadanía y fácil de usar para los periodistas. Yo creo cada vez más que no podemos hacer periodismo solos, tenemos que hacerlo con múltiples disciplinas. Hablábamos algo sobre el trauma también, hay que trabajar con psicólogos en muchos casos para poder abordar a una persona víctima o sobreviviente de violencia, y también hay que trabajar con expertos en tecnología para poder hacer herramientas cada vez mejores, que nos mantengan seguros, pero que también nos ayuden a que la gente pueda tener más información y mejor información mucho más fácil de leer y más fácil de procesar. Entonces sí creo que es importante como sí abrirnos un poco, pero también trabajar con estas otras disciplinas para poder lograr el objetivo.
Gracias.
Hola, gracias. Soy de Honduras y gracias por tener este espacio. Quería hablar acerca de la audiencia y de este tema que tiene que ver mucho con cultura y costumbres, acerca de la narrativa autoritaria, la narrativa de la dictadura. ¿Cómo ustedes recomendarían, cómo se hablan de temas que tienen que ver mucho con las costumbres de una comunidad, así como esta narrativa autoritaria, y cómo uno trata de pelear contra esa narrativa, cómo uno se acerca a esta historia de una manera que también tiene en consideración la costumbre de la audiencia?
Siempre como periodista tienes que darle la voz a los demás. O sea, no es un tema personal, no es un tema tuyo, no es un tema de una línea editorial, es el tema de hacer periodismo para mejorar las condiciones de la sociedad en la que te estás desarrollando. Y la mejor manera de narrar, de construir una narrativa contra el autoritarismo es darle la voz a la sociedad, es darle la voz a la gente, a los grupos. Ahorita en México, por ejemplo, no es reciente, yo creo que en los últimos 2 sexenios, los últimos 12 años, se han creado muchos grupos, se han fundado muchos grupos sociales que buscan a sus desaparecidos, madres que buscan a sus hijos, otros que buscan justicia para sus muertos, que fueron sus personas que fueron asesinadas y no han obtenido la justicia, otros que buscan información, otros que buscan proteger esa información. Entonces son grupos de la sociedad civil que se fundaron y se crearon para contrarrestar un cierto nivel de autoritarismo en los distintos gobiernos que hemos tenido en los últimos 3 sexenios, contando el actual. Entonces, a través de esas voces que se puede y se debe de construir esa narrativa, estando el periodista cerca de la sociedad y lejos del gobierno.
Yo creo también que es importante entender nuestras sociedades, y lo que decimos es muy importante porque a veces como no entendemos a nuestras sociedades. El Latinobarómetro, que siempre saca estas encuestas, ¿no? En nuestros países, en Latinoamérica, en Honduras, por ejemplo, la mayor parte de la gente prefiere una dictadura a la democracia, y esa es la realidad. Y a esa audiencia que le gusta el autoritarismo porque lo ve útil, porque le resuelve ciertos problemas importantes, como si el presidente dice que hay 0 homicidios, la gente dice, bueno, es un autoritario, es un dictador, pero hay menos muertos. Entonces hay que entender primero para saber cómo hablarle a esa audiencia, obviamente sin menospreciar sus razones por las cuales prefiere una dictadura, pero tratar de explicarlo a profundidad. Contextualizar es sumamente importante, pero hay periodistas que se van un poco al extremo y dicen es que hay que escribir contra el público, porque el público quiere algo que es banal, que es superfluo, que no le gusta la información profunda. Tampoco podemos generalizar así, ¿no? Pero a veces sí nos toca decirle a las personas cosas que son muy incómodas. No solamente estamos incomodando al poder y al gobierno, sino también a veces a nuestras propias audiencias y a nuestras propias sociedades. Nuestras sociedades son machistas, digamos. Si empezamos a escribir sobre, bueno, los derechos de la población LGTBI, los derechos de las mujeres, que los femicidios, a nosotras nos atacan más por los temas de género a veces que por los temas de corrupción. ¿Voy a dejar de hacerlo porque mi sociedad es machista? No. Entonces, ¿voy a ser incómoda para mi sociedad machista? Sí. Entonces, pero hay que ser como... Hay que tener claro, ¿no? Eso primero al momento de escribir para que podamos construir nuestras historias de una mejor manera y tener la conciencia clara. Yo voy a escribir esta historia y le va a incomodar a mi sociedad que prefiere el autoritarismo y prefiere ser machista.
If I could jump in there for, I think, just for anyone who doesn't understand Spanish, it's a very fascinating discussion. They're talking about like the journalism in Central America, particularly in Honduras, I think El Salvador as well, very similar. Guatemala, where you have a lot of people are basically in favor of authoritarian governments, and how do you kind of look at this in journalism? I think one thing I would observe with this, and I think this relates as well to journalism here in the United States or in Europe, in Mexico, whatever. There's a bit of a danger, like say if you look at the case of Honduras, El Salvador, you have on one side a lot of kind of quite sensational journalism, often in favor of, say, the government. Quite simplistic, say in El Salvador, which is kind of very pro-government. Mm-hmm. But then you've got a section of kind of critical journalism, but it is, like Jennifer was saying a bit, it's kind of almost like anti-populist sometimes. It's almost like, I mean, the fact is, and the situation in El Salvador, if you look at a lot of, say, the foreign coverage of El Salvador right now, it's like, okay, Bukele's a monster, Bukele's putting a bunch of people in prison, but this guy's got like an 80% approval rating. Yeah. So like really, so how do you combat this as a journalism? I think it would be good, and it's the same as in the United States. I mean, as Javier was saying, there's a lot of attack on the credibility of journalism in the United States. It's very, very divided, and just to try and say, well, we've got a certain point of view of a kind of a moral high ground, and we're going to write from this point of view. I don't think it's a good strategy really for working and trying to reach people. We've got to try and say and kind of understand as well, what Jennifer was saying, understand how people are supporting certain things and doing it in a kind of in a way that can reach people, but in a more profound way, not the simplistic way. So it's kind of just get around to saying I think it is a very, very challenging situation, but we can't take a point of view of journalists just saying that everybody's wrong. We have to understand their points of view. And also the problem is in, I think, say in El Salvador particularly, and it's a problem for us as journalists generally in Mexico as well. If we're criticizing governments for being authoritarian and using crime as the excuse to be authoritarian, what options are we looking at to deal with crime? And we have to understand that people are really angry about crime and really hate a lot of the situation of crime. So how do we kind of address those concerns as well?
Thank you so much.
Well, with that, I just want to thank our panelists. Please look into the part 2 of this discussion in tomorrow at noon, right, Abby, is when we're going to be here. I hope that some of you will be attending the award ceremony tomorrow, not tomorrow evening, and in the future, because these are some of the speeches and discussions and conversations at the table are quite illuminating, quite inspiring, and just from our discussion today, I think all of us have learned a great deal. So thank you very much for being here.